Hello, sourcers. Welcome to another installment in the Procurement 101 series. It's only been like a year and a half, 2 years since I've added a video to this series. And this particular topic is vendor relationship management, or supplier relationship management, or third-party management, or external entity management. There are a lot of names for this function of procurement, but regardless of the name, this function is extremely important. It is extremely strategic. And I even busted out my biscuits and gravy hat for this video to keep consistency with all of the other videos from a year and a half ago. It took me a long time to find this hat. Biscuits and gravy. Loveless Cafe, Nashville, Tennessee. Didn't get paid for that. For the sake of this video, I am going to call this function vendor management. Like I mentioned before, there are a lot of different names. I'm going to keep it simple for this video and for everyone watching. So what is vendor relationship management? Vendor relationship managers maintain the relationship between vendors or suppliers or whatever you want to call them and the customers that consume the products. Vendor relationship managers are liaisons. They are facilitators between these two entities, between the internal customer and the external vendor. Relationship managers are also the facilitators of the procurement process, procurement policy, legal policy, purchasing policy. They need to understand all of these bits and pieces to make sure the governance and structure and relationship with a supplier is strong and without complications, or at least less complications. The term supplier relationship management was coined in 1983 by a McKinsey director named Peter Kraljic, and he published an article in the Harvard Business Review, and that was sort of the foundational element of vendor management or supplier relationship management. Someone realized that there had to be a strategic vision for these vendors, and you can't just keep buying from them. They had to be managed. There had to be governance. So what are the primary functions of a vendor manager? One of the major things that they have to do is review all of the contracts and all of the purchasing paperwork involved with the particular supplier that they're managing. They have to understand the governance structure between the two companies and identify if there are any gaps or any lapses that need to be addressed with more paperwork. Who doesn't love more paperwork? A vendor manager needs to understand the service level agreements between the vendor and the customer. If there are performance guarantees, the vendor manager needs to understand those, because if the supplier is not achieving them on a consistent basis, a legal action may need to take place or credits may have to be issued back to the company. Vendor managers need to understand what's happening outside of the company. They need to understand the risks of doing business with a specific supplier. So if there are outstanding legal judgments, if there is M&A activity, if the supplier their leadership is changing and the C-level is changing, if they're about to be acquired, if their finances aren't doing well, a vendor relationship manager needs to be on top of that constantly to understand if their company is about to assume more risk. I want to give a real-time example of supplier risk that's happening right now in the market as I film this in October of 2022. There's a technology company called Pegasystems that has a judgment and legal suit against them by a company named Appian. Pegasystems, per the lawsuit, apparently stole IP, intellectual property, from this Appian company, and a judge agreed. There was a fairly egregious trail of emails going back and forth where the company executives knew what they were doing and admitted it, and it got out to the public. There is a $2 billion settlement against Pegasystems right now. And that settlement, based on the amount of cash reserves and revenue that Pegasystems currently has, if they move forward, if they do not negotiate down that settlement, this company is in really bad shape. They could be acquired by another company or a private equity firm. They may go under. There's a lot of things that are happening. And right now, we know that the company is in a saving cycle and they're not developing their products as much as they normally do. That is a problem all around, and that is something that a vendor manager should be very aware of. Other primary functions that a vendor manager should be doing: develop portfolios of the supplier, how they fit in certain categories. And a vendor manager should really be developing segments where these suppliers are applying their services and their products and how they're performing in those segments. An interesting thing is a company may not stay in one segment. They may have a variety of products and services that they're offering, and their execution may vary across the board. In some areas, they may be best in class. In others, they may be emerging. And in other areas, they may be total failures. So it's important not just to assume that at a supplier or vendor level that they're performing the same way. They have to be evaluated on each individual service and product that they offer. It's important to understand how the vendors are performing in these segments and in these categories against their competitors. Is a product that you bought 5 years ago still performing the same way? Is it still considered best in class? Or has it fallen behind because they got lazy? It's important to constantly reevaluate and assess how the products and tools and services that you're buying, how they're performing against peers and disruptors. Another critical function of vendor managers is to consistently conduct surveys to the internal customer base to determine how the supplier is performing on a quarterly and annual basis, so we can track performance over time to see if supplier is trending up or trending down. If they're consistently trending down, it's time for a change. So how does a vendor manager differentiate themselves, differentiate the value that they bring to the company? I've been having conversations with my employees about this very topic. That's why I'm doing this video. Sometimes vendor managers don't understand how critical their role is and what they can ultimately bring to the organization and what they can do for and against the vendor. It's really important for vendor managers to understand and to know how their customers feel about a supplier. Is a supplier really easy to do business with? What if a supplier is notoriously difficult to do business with? I'm looking at you, Oracle. You may be in a situation where you know that a company is producing a best-in-class product. They know it. They're awful to negotiate with, but you're constantly on the lookout for that competitor to hit a certain milestone where you can pivot. It's important to know how your customers feel about difficult suppliers and if they have an appetite to switch things up and go with a competitor. As I mentioned before, you have to understand over the long term how a supplier is trending and how they're performing from a market perspective. It's one thing to understand customers' feelings internally, but what are they doing from an innovation and value perspective out in the market? And to that point, you have to understand who your vendor's main competitors are and how they're performing. I want the vendor managers of the world to understand how much power they have. I want them to understand that they can make and break a relationship with a supplier. They can let a customer know if it's okay to proceed or if they should proceed or if they should start to move away from a particular vendor. It's important for vendor managers to know when contracts are expiring. It's important for vendor managers to know the market data, to know who the competitors are, to know who could come in and do the same job with the minimal disruption. And it's really important to know if any of those vendors are already in-house and you already have contracts with them and you already have other customers that have opinions about their performance. And as much as we focused on the supplier not performing, let's talk about the inverse. Sometimes your customer isn't right. The customer is not always right. Sometimes they have unrealistic expectations of the vendor. Sometimes they're asking the vendor to perform services that are not in the scope of their contracts, and then they get upset and angry. Sometimes there are situations where the vendor just can't perform. It's a force majeure situation. They can't deliver their services. It's outside of their hands. And the vendor manager has to understand and articulate that and convey those issues to the customers. So it could be that a customer is really upset with a vendor and it's out of the vendor's hands and they really are a good performer and they still are best in class and it still may be the best competitive pricing. And the other piece is the vendor, all things being equal, may also have a business relationship with your company. They may have a B2B situation, and if you decide to terminate a contract, you may be introducing a whole other level of risk for your corporation. You have to understand the entire spectrum of the relationship and the levers to pull based on how the supplier is performing. And like any relationship, at home, at work, sometimes people get too comfortable. So again, you may know that you have a good supplier. They know they have a good thing going, but maybe they're getting a little lazy. Maybe they're getting a little sloppy. Maybe they're getting a little bit more expensive. They may have some COLA language built in, cost of living increases, where your rates are just going up and up and up, but the market is not reflecting that. You don't necessarily have to throw the supplier away, the vendor away. You can do an RFI. You can indicate to them that there's a bidding event happening and that this business is theirs to lose. And they may adjust their pricing ahead of the RFP event or during the RFP event because now they are educated that they are not the only game in town. It's a little harsh, but it's a good lesson for a vendor to learn. A vendor manager needs to feel comfortable in ambiguity. The day-to-day activities of a vendor manager is never static. Here's a technical tip that I have to offer you. If you don't have a ton of data tools and information tools that are sending you information about your suppliers, I highly recommend that you set up a Google RSS alert for every single supplier that you're interacting with. You can set it up for daily notices, hourly notices, or weekly notices. But set up an RSS reader or an RSS feed. You can do it in email too. I wouldn't want it in email. And I would set that up so I can read what's happening with the supplier every single day. It's very difficult to keep tabs on everything that they're doing. And it's helpful when there is a service like a Google Alert or some other system that can provide you that information. Vendor managers, you need to ensure that you have regular sessions, regular review sessions with your internal customers. And if there are multiple groups or multiple departments that are consuming products from a company, you have to bring all of those people together. Sometimes one division is super high on a supplier and they need to hear if there are problems happening on the other side of the shop. It's critical to convene and bring people together to hear the broader problems and to work together to either fix them or to move on to another provider. I'm going to leave you with something that I've been saying to my relationship managers for the last year. You have the keys to the car. You're driving the car. Where do you want to take it? If you have a supplier that you genuinely think is doing an excellent job and we should try to grow their business, how do you do that? You need to convey that. You need to let your customers know that they are great and that they should grow, they should continue to get the business. And if they're the villains, if everybody hates doing business with them, what is the strategy to move away? That doesn't happen magically. That doesn't happen automatically. There has to be a strategy. There has to be a timeline. There has to be alternatives. All of that is within your power to develop and to execute. A vendor manager's job is to convene. A vendor manager's job is to educate. A vendor manager's job is to investigate. You have to get the information. You have to pull the threads together. You have to tell a compelling story and you have to educate your customers on where to go next. And that is the job, and it's an exciting job. And it's a strategic job, and it's a critical job. The corporate world is better off for having vendor managers, and I hope that you found this video educational, informative, and hopefully for my supplier managers and vendor managers out there, a little bit inspiring. Thank you for the work that you do. And for those just watching, I hope you're interested in the role because it's a great one. Take care, and I'll be back eventually with another video.